I will give a bit of a prologue. So I realise there's quite a few new people in the audience who haven't heard about the GI Symbol program, so I'll give a very quick overview of where we're at. Tom has sort of alluded to some of the background information. So the Glycemic Index Foundation started working with Standards Australia in 2003 to develop the Australian standard for GI testing. We formed a working party in 2004, scientists from the GI Foundation, from our Commonwealth Scientific Investigation and Research Organisation, which, as the name suggests, is a government organisation, and the Australian Food and Grocery Council. So government, industry and not-for-profit working together to develop this standard. And it took quite a few years. It was published in 2007 as the Australian Standard 4694-2007. Now that was later adopted, and in fact you can see the timelines here. It wasn't in fact gazetted until 2013, but it does reference that Australian standard within our Food Standards Code, which is quite an important development. And you can see there's the definition there, much along the lines of what Tom discussed earlier. And in fact, there are also the definitions of low, medium and high GI. I'm not sure if it's got a pointer. Yes, it does. So the definitions of low, medium and high are actually in our Food Standards Code. And there is also a nutrition profiling scoring system based on kilojoule, saturated fat, sodium, dietary fibre, etc. So basically, low GI claims in Australia are only allowed on foods that are generally considered to be healthy choices. And here's an example of a muesli that contains a generic low GI claim that you can see there, amongst a number of other nutrition content claims. I should add that in Australia, the GI is actually considered a nutrition content claim, not a general level of health claim or a high level health claim. It's just considered to be like low fat or high fibre. Now, as soon as we'd finished the Australian standard, we started developing the international standard, and the working party was convened in 2006. And there were scientists around the globe, including, of course, many of the people that are in this room today. And we all worked for many years on that. It was subsequently published in 2010. I think it went through about 70 different committees along the course of the development. So we were pretty happy when it was finally gazetted. And Tom's demonstrated very nicely that it actually seems to have improved the quality of GI testing, which we're very, very pleased to hear. Now, the alternate model, and I put in the date deliberately, we actually started the first GI symbol labelling back in 2002. So you can sort of see the two parallel systems. One was the official food standards route. The other was our certification trademark, which is registered in Australia, New Zealand, the US, European Union, and in parts of Asia. And it also includes a nutrition profile scoring system. So we actually developed ours prior to the Fazan's model. Again, it has kilojoule, saturated fat, sodium, dietary fibre, etc. But I must say, in fact, there's the details there. You can see the overall criteria there. And the models actually align very, very well. So they're very closely aligned, the government model versus ours. Even though they were developed, ours was developed in the late 90s, the government one much, much later than that. And here's an example that you can see for a very common product, breakfast cereals, which are very popular in Australia still. You can see there's criteria for the fat, basically limiting the amount of saturated fat, making it a reasonable source of dietary fibre, and not too high in sodium for this particular food category. And there are many different food categories, so it's a category-specific system. And just a smattering of foods that carry the GI symbol that you can see. So we've got basically a healthy low GI choice within each of the major food categories, and it does in fact include fresh fruits and vegetables as well. So we really are trying to encourage those healthier choices all around. Now, of course, in order to get the GI symbol, we must recommend laboratories around the world, and this is direct from our website. At the moment, we recommend Sydney Uni GI Research Service, which is independent of the GI Foundation, I should add. Of course, GI Labs for North America, and Europe and the UK in particular is those two. And the reason we choose those is because we have seen reports from there and we can compare them against the ISO, and we can see that they are testing to the standard that is required. But we do believe we need a global accreditation process. So, and this is moving into the guts of the talk. So the purpose of the accreditation program is to evaluate GI test laboratory operations to ensure that GI testing is performed to the standard prescribed in the ISO, as Tom has described, including requirements covering ethics approval, laboratory facilities, determination of available carbohydrate, blood collection and analysis, statistical analysis and reporting. To promote the services of accredited laboratories for GI testing to the standard accepted by the Glycemic Index Foundation, for licensing of the GI certified trademark, and also to allow accredited labs to advertise their accreditation with a GIF accredited lab trademark. So basically it's a win-win situation for all partners involved. We have worked, in fact, it was 2 years ago in Stresa that Tom Oliver and Fiona Atkinson and I sat down and really fleshed out most of this. And the current consultant for the GI Foundation is Kirsty Bell, who's just finished her PhD in our group. Now there are 3 phases, and I'm going to go through them briefly. The verification of laboratory facilities and the protocol, food preparation and testing methodology and data analysis, and lastly, quality assurance. So the first phase, hopefully you can read that at the back of the room. So an overview of laboratory facilities and processes. So we actually get the lab to take photos or videos of each of the steps of their testing process and its location in the laboratory. We really want to run this on a minimal cost basis, so rather than somebody fly over, and Australia is a long way away, I'm afraid, rather than fly over to every single country around the world and spend time there looking at it, we'd rather people do it and send us the details outlining food preparation, consumption, blood collection techniques, blood storage, blood analysis, etc. The name, model and photo of blood glucose analyzer, the frequency of calibration, looking at the physical environment which the activities are performed, blood collection methods, equipment, including calibration. And then we have a checklist that's based literally on the ISO. So we go through and check off, look at all of the pictures, the videos, and make sure it conforms to the ISO with respect to that. Then we look at the GI test reporting. We ask for recent test reports and raw data from 3 different foods, a sugary food, a starchy food, so that we can look at the differences between the 2 main types and look at the way they record and report the results. And again, we have a checklist that covers all of the main parameters that are covered in the ISO. Finally, protocol assessment, a completed protocol questionnaire, which covers all of the main points that you can see there, so ethics, management, validation, etc. And there's a protocol questionnaire, again, based around the ISO. So that's phase 1. Phase 2, data analysis. They actually provide us the GI test results for the raw data, which we reanalyse and look at the way that they have looked at the outliers that was talked about earlier. And we just get that in Excel format. The test foods, we actually send 2 test foods to the company, one again a high starch and one a high sugars food to see, and they don't know of course what the GI value is, so it's done blinded. They're actually white foods, so they can't really guess it either, and we're looking forward to analysing that shortly. And then of course we check it again against the results that we know for those foods because we've tested them at sugars. And lastly, test portion calculation, so the nutrition information or nutrition facts panel as you call it here, and the ingredient list for 5 foods. So we have a whole range of foods, really looking for the common pitfalls that are found within the assessment of the amount of food used for GI testing, particularly the available carbohydrate, which varies around the globe, basically what you call net carbohydrate here. And you can see the main systems we're looking at are liquid foods, foods that you have to prepare with milk, foods with sugar alcohols, foods that need cooking, and then mixed meals like a yogurt and muesli mix, which are quite popular, I noticed, in the United States and North America as well. And the last phase is looking at continued ethics approval, looking at test reports from the organisation, ongoing quality assurance, and I think most importantly, we're hoping to do basically every 2 years a sort of mini inter-laboratory study where we can see how each lab is going by sending out some foods that are obviously blinded so that we can test how well the lab is going. Now we have done a pilot study and I was hoping to have final results, I haven't quite got them yet. It is in a New Zealand GI test facility. I might add that there are several labs in New Zealand that do GI testing, so I won't identify that particular one. You can see if we look and compare to the phases, the first phase, We actually did identify some minor issues with the reference food, so they're using something that I actually hadn't seen before, and also with the blood collection methods. There were also some issues with the way the incremental area under the curve was measured, and we haven't got to the bottom of that yet, so we're not quite sure what the issue was there. And also they were making some nutrition claims within the body of the report that we thought was probably inappropriate. But we didn't see any issues with the protocol assessment overall. Unfortunately, we are still awaiting results for the data analysis. We did send as a test food a white rice and a sugar blend. Interesting to see what the results are when they came back. And we did identify in the theoretical calculations, again, the issue with dietary fibre. So in Australia and New Zealand, our total carbohydrates actually take away the fibre already, whereas, of course, in North America, it's included in total carbohydrates. And it seems that this particular lab got that issue confused, which was kind of interesting. They also were looking at the availability of the polyols and didn't quite take that into account, and also had an issue with the specific gravity in one of the liquid foods. So there were a range of issues that were identified in this whole process, which I think is quite useful in itself. So our interpretation of the results so far, so there were minor issues identified in both phase 1 and phase 2. We will need to address these completely in the third phase. Obviously, if it's not corrected, then the accuracy of the GI test results are going to be compromised, and we're not going to recommend them as a recommended laboratory. And of course, we wouldn't be using our GI symbol on foods that have been tested at that lab either. But of course, it's not going to be the end of the story. It's quite important from our perspective to work with labs to ensure that the number of accredited labs around the world continues to grow. So we will probably give them what we call provisional accreditation and work with them over the next couple of years to bring them up to the level of the ISO, so that we can later rely on their results for our labelling program. The longer term objectives, I think, and this is coming at it very much from a pragmatic perspective, I really do believe that each region around the world, if not each country, but at least each region, needs its own accredited laboratory to test its own food supply. I mean, all the dietitians and the nutritionists in the room will know that every single country has its own nutrition composition tables for all the macro and micronutrients. We should be having the same GI database, if you like, linked to those as we have done in Australia. I think that would be great, very practical. I think there's also an opportunity, as alluded to perhaps in Tom's talk, to further refine the ISO. I mean, it was done quite a number of years ago now, and looks like some great evidence there that it's working. But I think certainly based on our pilot study, perhaps a bit more detail in the ISO might improve the quality of that testing. And of course, that'll have flow-on effects for the scientific research conducted around the world. If your own country has its own food and nutrition database with GI values for your own foods, then obviously the GI research, the scientific research around that is going to be of a much higher quality, rather than relying on data from other parts of the world, particularly from Australia. And I might add, we might seem to have the same food companies with even similar brands to yours, but the ingoing ingredients and the way they're processed is often quite different. And a good example is a product called Kellogg's Special K, where it's actually different in Europe as it is different in Australia and North America. So it's got the same name, it's the same company, but it's actually a different product. So I think it's quite important that we tease out those differences so that we can improve the quality of GI research around the world. And of course, ultimately, from our perspective, we would like to roll out the GI Symbol program globally, one way or the other, and we think this will help facilitate that process as well. So, in summary, to make GI claims on foods down under, foods must be tested using the Australian standard or the ISO. So the Australian standard is in the government's Food Standards Code. The ISO is the GI Foundation's requirement. The GI Foundation only recommends laboratories that test to these standards, and there are very few around the world at the moment, so we'd certainly like there to be more. In collaboration with Canada's GI Labs, Sydney Uni GI Research Service, and the GI Foundation, we have developed a 3-phase accreditation program. It assesses the lab facilities and protocols, food preparation, testing methodology, and data analysis, and it will also include ongoing data analysis and quality assurance, It will facilitate the testing of local foods around the globe, help improve the quality of research on GI, GL, and encourage label programs. And there's our contact details. And I look forward to some questions from the floor.
How much is the cost of this accreditation? And is it once upon a time, or it needs to get accreditation year after year, and therefore the cost will go
Yes.
going to increase?
Very good question. I thought about putting costing questions in it. This is just the pilot study, so we don't know. We really want to run it on a break-even basis. We are a not-for-profit organisation, and we simply want to cover costs. At this stage, I'm hoping it'll be less than 2,000 Australian dollars. I don't know what the exchange rate is for the euro at the moment. It's about 75 US cents, I think, and slightly less Canadian dollars. So that's really what we're aiming for. That's the initial, the big first assessment, and then probably every 2 years, as I said, we'll have some sort of inter-laboratory set up, which I think will only be a few $100s. I mean, we really just want to break even. So we don't want to make it cost prohibitive or a barrier. We really want to encourage the highest quality research, not trying to make money out of it.
Yeah, I think this is a major issue to consider, because what we really want is that this assessment of glycemic index includes as many foods as possible, and is performed by as many laboratories of good quality, of course, as possible. Because if it is going to be restricted and it is very expensive, then no one who has no profit interest in this issue will be going to make this assessment. We once evaluated potato dumplings, and we show that it has a very low glycemic index. Okay, that's nice to know, and we want to promote this information, but we have no specific economic interest in potato dumplings. So if we have to pay in order to make this information available, obviously that is not worthwhile. And as we did ourselves, being involved in research, I think many other people in the world happen to get into this low glycemic index food discovery just by chance, or because they are pursuing that aim. And it's nice that if you can spread this information with some quality assurance about the methodology, but at costs which are affordable for research entities.
I totally agree with you, and we'll be doing it as the cheapest we can possibly afford to.
Thank you very much for this. Clearly, this is much required, so well done. You rightly suggested that we should, in testing local foods, we should do local analyses of the foods. And one of the issues we've been faced with here is getting the right numbers for things like dietary fiber. And so in the recommendations, I wonder whether there was any guidance on how to derive the available carbohydrate, because for example, we've reverted to using total starch as glycemic carbohydrate rather than by difference. So I was just wondering whether there is any consideration for guiding the users of the program towards deriving available carbohydrates.
The ISO allows the available carbohydrate by difference method, which is very commonly used around the globe. It also allows the summation of the individual components, so starches, oligosaccharides, sugars, polyols, etc. So the GI Foundation encourages the latter method. We prefer it to be the summation of the individual components rather than carbohydrate, the difference. And I think particularly in plant fresh produce, where the variability perhaps is potentially greater from what's listed in food composition tables. And I think Tom mentioned that there's an allowance of 50% variability in nutrition information panels, for example. And certainly that's the case in Australia. 20 to 40% variation is not uncommon. So it's, at least in theory, we believe it's better to use the summation method. And that's what we encourage from a GI symbol program perspective. But as I said, the ISO allows either method to be used.
Joe.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed
Speak a
that.
bit louder.
I very much enjoyed that. You mentioned the polyols. In Australia, polyols are part of the available carbohydrates, but we know that they're only partly available as carbohydrate. How does the accreditation process deal with that issue?
In Australia, polyols are actually listed separately. Australia has some pretty bizarre ways of dealing with carbohydrates. We only list total carbs and sugars, and polyols are actually tacked on at the end. So it's relatively unclear in the Food Standards Code, so much so that I would like to put in an application to FSANZ to vary that. Jenny is probably going to talk about the actual things that sugars do, if that's okay.
The ISO standard actually includes a table that comes from Jeff's company, and it has about 20 different semi-digestible carbohydrates, like the polyols, and we give a percentage of what should be considered available and what should be considered unavailable. So say it's sorbitol, we might say 50% of that sorbitol should be considered available. So it's not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction.
And that list was put together again by the team that did the ISO, so there was a lot of input from people around the world, Jeff.